Hi, Simon. I'll make brief introductions. I am Yoram Gat. I am a sortition advocate, activist. I've been so for almost 2 decades now, I think. My main channel of activity is the Equality by Lot blog, which can be found at equalitybylot.com. That's, I think it's through that blog that I met Simon, and then came to know about his interest and his activities regarding sortition. I'll let Simon introduce himself. So please
Sure thing. Yoram, it's awesome to have the opportunity to chat with you about this. So I'm a faculty member at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. And my teaching, basically teaching and research, looks at alternative organizations and ways we can make them work in a more democratic manner. And that's how I, over time, got really interested in democratic innovations, but also the use of sortition as a potential tool. And also I'm a co-founder of Democracy in Practice, which is devoted to using tools like lotteries in the context of schools.
All right, cool. So when you learned about sortition, what were the or you know, throughout your interest in this topic, what were the most interesting and influential and you know, useful works that you encountered and that you'd recommend people to consult with?
Yeah, and so just as a quick background, so initially just came across this idea of sortition through a very good friend of mine who started looking at kind of how democratic systems can potentially be at the root cause of either solutions or causes of problems like environmental and social and sustainability. And so at one point he read Lynn Carson and Brian Martin's book, Random Selection in Politics, which I think we were both blown away by. It was a fantastic read, very easy to understand, written in a humble manner, and covers so many different examples. So that's one that really got me started on my journey, and through that explored a lot of different books and articles written since then. And as you know, the field has just exploded over the last few decades. So there's tons of good stuff. But I would also recommend Barbara Goodwin's Justice by Lottery is a fantastic book, and her opening chapter on her envisioned utopia of aleatoria was really fun, but also opened my eyes to just how many different contexts we can use lotteries in. And then finally, I would just recommend the book Legislature by Lot, which recently came out by the Real Utopias Project, which is just fantastic. And their whole reason for being to kind of create exciting, positive alternatives out there and study them in depth is I think just a great way of doing research. And their book really unravels this possibility and its pros and cons.
Cool. Okay, so now since we've covered how you came to sortition a bit and other people's work, why don't you describe a bit your focus and your interest in what kind of potential you see for sortition?
Totally. So over the last few years, I've tried to refocus as much of my research as possible on using democratic innovations, including sortition, to improve the democracy in a broad array of democratic organizations. And so those can include anything from cooperatives to schools to school boards, labor unions, et cetera. Basically everything that's a non-state democratic organization. In my personal opinion, I think the amazing research on kind of democratic innovations and deliberation has not yet transcended into other democratic organizations. And I think those are, equally important to keep a close eye on. So I have a few conceptual and empirical projects on that space. And then I also really like applying these tools wherever possible, kind of in the public realm too. So we did a pilot project at the University of Victoria, our students' dialogue on democratic engagement, to involve students in kind of public deliberations on issues that matter to them. That was really nice. And then I'm a member of a steering committee on a forthcoming Ontario Assembly on Workplace Democracy, in which a group of us are launching this summer to give everyday Ontarians a chance to learn and deliberate about a new agenda for a worker voice in the future. So that's kind of the main area of my interest in this space.
All right. And I guess this provides a direct segue to your most, I think it's your most recent work, or at least that's the most recent one that I'm aware of, and that is an article called "Drawing Out Democracy," which deals with the application of sortition in worker-owned firms. And why don't you tell us a bit about this? This is an article that was published, you published in 2019, I believe, right? Or 2021? Yeah, why don't you tell us about the main ideas in this article?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for being interested in it and wanting to chat about it. Kind of from a broad perspective, I think worker ownership and workplace democracy are just really important considerations for me. And I think they have a lot of benefits for workers, the organizations they work in, but also broader society. And there's a huge push right now to democratize work and kind of challenge the status quo that exists in a lot of contexts. So I think that's kind of the context for why I think it's important to focus on this kind of sphere of economic activity. And obviously, being democratic is very important, both inherently, but also for them to be able to achieve a lot of their benefits. So I got interested in looking at, how does democracy work in these worker-owned firms, and quickly came across this phenomenon of organizational degeneration, which tends to happen as worker-owned firms, like a worker co-op, for example, grow and scale over time. And broadly speaking, organizational degeneration would refer to a situation in which power in a democratic organization becomes centralized in a small and often unrepresentative group of leaders, all the while other members of the worker-owned firm, everyday workers, become more and more apathetic and participate less and less in the tools they have available to them. So I was immediately thinking at that time, like, what possibility, if any, could the use of sortition have in addressing some of these issues and preventing them from happening in the first place? So the paper is basically devoted to looking at organizational degeneration, first to see if we can identify a new cause of it by looking at selection method, which is typically elections, and then also, and as a second step, looking at whether sortition could offer an alternative that could prevent some of these challenges from happening.
Right. So this concept or this phenomenon of what you call organizational degeneration is it seems very much related to what's known as the iron law of the oligarchy. Right. This is a concept that was I think the term was coined by Michel in the early 20th century, and he was examining. Also, it's like worker-owned co-ops, organizations that are supposedly formed around democratic ideas. Right? These were socialist parties, and he observed that that even though these organizations, maybe unlike other organizations of his time, but like most organizations in our time, had professed democratic ideals, and yet they tended to produce an oligarchy in which, as you said, what you call the organizational degeneration happens. That is, power gets concentrated, and there becomes a class or a subset of the members of the organizations which concentrate political power. And he called it an iron law, and claimed that it is largely inevitable. And indeed, it seems to be a very, very common, very, very, I don't know if it's inevitable, and this is something we want to actually probably discuss, but I think many people see that in the context of the state, right? Again, our state is most modern states, certainly in the West, they claim to be democratic and profess democratic ideals, and supposedly our entire system is built around making sure that the system is democratic. And yet, I think, fewer and fewer people believe that this is the case, right? There is a widespread recognition, or at least sentiment, that the modern states are not democratic, and that power is concentrated, that there is a political class that is somewhat insular and self-sustaining and so on, and therefore and monopolizes power and is self-serving, oppresses, right, exploits people, the mass majority. We all know the statistics, I presume, that in the West, while the elites have been becoming richer and richer, the median income has been stagnating, and so on and so on. So, sorry to have made this long speech. Why is this happening? Why is this happening? Maybe in general and specifically inside worker-owned firms.
Yeah, and I think the background you provided there is really important. So I think a lot of the work on organizational degeneration does draw from Michel's, and then there are various kind of phase models of degeneration that have been offered. And I think it's important also to highlight that while there initially was a big push in this body of research on how, it is kind of a quote unquote iron law, a lot of people since then have said, it's not really an iron law. It's more of perhaps like a tendency that can happen. And many people have tried to identify other, alternatives and ways that it could be prevented and overcome. And sometimes that's captured under the umbrella of the regeneration thesis as well. So I guess my take on it, and the reason I was interested in exploring selection method is that elections can be a pretty significant cause of that, especially if we purely rely on elections and don't question other alternatives and tools, we could use as an alternative. But I think, if we look at the process of electing, like if we take, the political process in the state and apply it to a worker-owned firm of a few hundred people, when it comes to one aspect of organizational degeneration, which would be the centralization of power, among a small group of people that might not be representative, elections do create an opening for those who want to have these kind of long-term roles as representatives, and in a way to make that a key part of the role in the organization, to self-select into pursuing that, which is kind of inherent in the use of elections. And also due to the need to campaign and potentially compete against other candidates, which in this case would be your fellow colleagues, those who don't want to engage in those dynamics or might be less charismatic or might have, lower status roles in the organization. What we can discern from political science in the state context is that these individuals might not be willing to put themselves up for election, or even if they did, they might have a higher likelihood of not winning in those elections. And then elected representatives in these contexts might also behave counter to the interests of the whole membership of workers, as they may be, they might have to behave strategically to be reelected. So they might focus on certain issues over others, or they might try to compensate those groups, or departments or anything in organization that helped them get elected in the first place. So elections there, I think, could be contributing to that dynamic as well, where over time it's easier for a small group of representatives to remain in power, and it's also easier or more likely that that group will not be representative of the whole body of workers. And then on the flip side, if you look at the dynamics of elections, if we park to the side other practices that a worker-owned firm can have to engage its workers and just focus on the elections, there's not that much engagement, right? I do think that campaign processes and even the option to learn about different platforms, that has a utility in a democratic organization. It makes people think about what do we care about, what are the issues that we should address vis-a-vis management, but it is quite passive. And so the idea that every year or two you might vote for a representative, it doesn't demand much attention from a worker. And so, especially as the organization gets larger and larger over time, people might see that there are diminishing returns for taking that process very seriously or for voting in the first place. And so they might start to check out over time. So I do for sure recognize that there are a lot of other practices that these worker-owned firms can have in place. But looking purely at the selection method of election, I think it can contribute a lot to these dynamics of the centralization of power, but also the reduced participation among the rest of the workers.
All right. So to try, I think I can identify two mechanisms that you of kind of oligarchizing mechanisms in the explanation for the oligarchizing effects of elections in your explanation. The first is I think what can be called to use Bernard Manin's term is the principle of distinction, that certain people are more likely to be elected, and those people, because of are elected because of certain properties that they have. You said higher status, whatever it could be, connections, and you said charisma. Some special properties of these people, and they make them both more electable and unrepresentative, and therefore, when they are in power, they promote policies and ideologies and ideas and values that are unique or that are special to them and to people like them, but are not representative of the entire organization. That's one mechanism, and the other mechanism that you mentioned is seems more associated with what's known as rational ignorance, or I don't know how to call it. What you mentioned, diminishing returns. The fact that a single person, even in a group of hundreds, not to mention in a group of millions, but even in a group of hundreds, may feel that whatever they do, it naturally has a relatively low impact, and therefore they don't bother to use whatever tools they do use. They can use. So people that are unelected are then, even though theoretically they could have some influence, they don't, because of this kind of again, the ratio between the effort and the impact. Although again, you could talk about rational ignorance. Maybe they don't even know what they can do, or even if they do know that they can do something, it takes too much effort. So I think we can. There are these two mechanisms. You believe those two mechanisms are kind of both of them are important, and because I think to some extent our belief or our analysis of how important each one of these mechanisms is could affect the solutions or the alternatives that we could adopt in order to counter those mechanisms. I think the first one pushes us towards sortition. The second one is kind of more tends to be more tends to well, let's say it doesn't necessarily push us towards sortition. It could push towards various ideas. I'm not even sure exactly which one would be the most effective, but to me, I think it is the first mechanism that I think is the most important. I think if we want to discuss other alternatives, and I think these kind of tend to be the standard solution. So the standard solution to the degeneration or the iron law of oligarchy is to say, well, we want to have mass participation. We want to encourage people to be more informed, to give them various ways to participate in various ways. And I think I personally, the reason that I'm very, very much interested in sortition and think this is really a promising idea is because I think the other ideas are much less powerful, and actually I think they've been tried over and over again, and their efficacy has been revealed to be quite low, and also this is not just an empirical fact, but also something that can be analyzed and understood theoretically. So I am before again. I've launched into a long speech. I'll let you answer that, and then also pick it up from there in terms of your analysis of what can be done in worker-owned firms in terms of both sortition and potential alternatives.
Totally. No, and again, I think your analysis is fantastic. So I really appreciate you discerning some potential arguments in what I was sharing before. And I think it makes a lot of sense for sure. And I think even like turning back to the principle of distinctiveness, right, is what it was termed, or distinction.
Principle of distinction, yes.
Right, distinction. So it's been a while since I've read that book. But it did prompt me.
Maybe I'll just mention the name of the book. So if viewers are interested, it's called the Principles of Representative Government by Bernard Manin. Originally published in French, but there is an English translation. Sorry.
Nice, yeah, totally. So it's I definitely really enjoyed that book when I had read it a few years ago. And it did prompt, when you were sharing that before, it did prompt me to think about another potential side effect as well, that as we know, elections do kind of create distinctions among individuals, and especially if you won an election and it was a hard-fought campaign, which doesn't always happen in a worker-owned firm, that can create potential distinctions among different groups of worker members as well, which is it's something that's important to keep in mind as well. And if you do want to have a high level of cohesion across different groups of workers, the idea that one person might be elected and therefore almost feel like they can and should represent others, might be a side effect that's problematic, but that we don't think about until we start questioning different selection methods, which is where something like sortition has a lot of potential benefits for us to consider. And I do completely agree with you that I think as we start talking about sortition, I think it is more geared towards the first cause that you analyze, but it might also have some knock-on benefits on the second one as well. But I think at this point it would be, we would need a lot more research on that. But I do think that, if sortition worked really well and it was structured in a way that people regularly rotate and then others might see that they're more interested, they might feel like they'll be called upon to take on that responsibility in the future. And it could, by getting rid of some of the unattractive dynamics of elections, people might see that it's kind of depoliticized and get more engaged with sortition as well. So I would agree with you for sure that the first one is kind of the main one that I was implicitly thinking about as I wrote the paper, but the second one is also really, really important to keep in mind too.
All right, so let's so you were so why don't you lay out a bit more in more detail your argument in the paper?
Totally. So as that first step, it was kind of looking at another potential cause of degeneration for the scholarly community to keep an eye on is this notion of selection method, particular elections, which can have some of those dynamics that we had talked about. And then in a second step, I tried to point this audience and all of us collectively to think about sortition as a potential alternative and or complement to the use of elections in these worker-owned firms. And so I tried to argue the same kind of dynamics that we had discussed around elections. What would sortition look like in that particular context? If we look for example, at the idea of how elections potentially enable people to develop a career as a representative, if they self-select into wanting that. Sortition makes that very unlikely, because it's hard for someone to continuously be reselected. The selection is out of one's hands, so it kind of does target that a little bit. It can also boost descriptive representativeness, especially if you have the right kind of stratification criteria in place. So that's really nice, and that helps tackle that issue. And then turning to the potential participation. So, if we look at participation as a representative, I think the use of sortition makes it a lot more attractive for people to, be interested in being a representative, because they don't have to self-select into campaigning to be a representative, which I think, again, we don't have a lot of research on that, but that's my hunch, that a lot of people don't want to take on that elected rep role because they don't want to distinguish themselves apart from their colleagues. And with sortition, it's out of everyone's hands. And so those people who just want to serve can find it, a very easy way to get into that. There's also, depending on how you structure it, there can be a higher turnover of representatives. But you could also argue the same for elections. But typically, the way sortition has been used, it rotates a lot more frequently, so that's beneficial. as we talked about, if you can depoliticize debates and politics and some of the heated rhetoric sometimes, potentially people's general interest in governance would increase, and they might become more aware and more interested in reading the newsletters and engaging with those arguments. And yeah, so those are some of the dynamics that I think could spill over in terms of the broader apathy. But again, we don't really know. And I know other proponents of elections might counter and say, well, at least having elections like forces the idea of governance onto the, the agenda periodically. And it's not perfect, but that's there. And, how could one argue that just having a random selection process every year or two will by default generate debate? So I think it's speculative at this point, but I have a hunch that it could work, especially if we really work on making it an important ceremony, having a lot of communications and having all those supportive practices to get the most out of it. Mm-hmm. And I guess in terms of, and I would also say, so that's kind of step 2. And then step 3, I think in this article, I deliberately left the question of implementation and ideal structures open-ended. And it was meant to be, I guess, more of an essay to bring home this idea of selection method and sortition to this audience of researchers, and to then hopefully start a conversation among do we want more deliberative mini publics? Do we want sortition to be a complement with elections, or how could we use it to be driven by future research? So for this paper specifically, I kind of left it at let's pay attention to selection method and let's consider sortition because of the great insights it's offered us from the state level.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I kind of had this question, but tell me if you feel you already answered it, which is why would sortition? So since we're talking about the generation as a kind of recurring phenomenon and how hard to counter phenomenon. And since there are these kind of traditional solutions which involve, talk about mass participation and regular participation and so on, why would sortition succeed where those other solutions or other purported solutions fail?
Yeah, so I think if we bucket them around 2 main things, so like some solutions might be focused on improving the conduct of elections. And so I think as we've talked about, I guess throughout the conversation, like those can definitely help at the margins, but the root problem still exists in some way. So if you do have regular turnover, that addresses some aspects of it, or you do have term limits, but you still have many of the same underlying dynamics. So I would say it's useful to just kind of potentially rethink that with other selection methods as complements or alternatives in some cases. When it comes to direct democracy, that's tricky because in this particular context, because many worker-owned firms start off small and have more collectivist, direct democratic structures, that is in many ways their comfort zone, and in many ways their ideal. And so there are a lot of people that aspire to going back to that and seeing how we can be as direct as possible. And I think there's a lot of merit to that and a lot worth exploring. But at the same time, there's a risk that especially as these organizations get larger and have hundreds, thousands, 10,000s of members in some cases, if you do want to rely purely on direct democracy in assemblies, it might just become unfeasible and too difficult to make a lot of decisions that way. So inevitably there'd be some level of representation, whether formal or informal, and that gets us back into the start of the conversation we had. And often we see, when they're in this context where there still are general assemblies for a lot of people, they're not often descriptively representative. It's people who might be available at that time or have a lot of interest. And so, even though we aspire to have full direct democracy, it ends up being either self-selection in some cases or another form of representation. And I think that's where still considering sortition as a complement or an alternative is very powerful.
All right. So how was the reception of your article? Did you get any response, positive, negative?
Yeah, I guess I initially, I wasn't sure how people would react, but It seems to me that this idea has resonated with a lot of both practitioners and researchers in the space, and I think it's one reason might be that a lot of cooperative scholars and practitioners really like, they care about democracy and inclusion so much, and then looking at alternative, at different ways of trying to foster that is just exciting to a lot of people. So I haven't gotten a lot of negative reaction to it, and one of the reasons for that could be that I didn't offer a very strong solution that's easy to argue against. It was more of like an opening conversation, so that could be part of it as well. And I'm assuming that if I had advocated for fully replacing an elected board with one based on sortition, people would have stronger views on that, and it could further that debate. With practitioners, I think there's been a lot of interest so far, and it's led to the beginning of some interesting collaborations on developing sortition-based bodies, in this case usually as a complement, but as different ways of including members.
This is from worker-owned firms that you're in contact with?
Yes, in kind of some collaborative research projects, which have been a lot of fun so far. And so I would say, it's quite cool, it's innovative, and as long as a worker-owned firm has, time and resources, which is, obviously very challenging given tight budgets in many organizations, I think a lot are very open to at least these like initial steps in terms of experimenting with it.
And I guess that leads me to my last question, which is what's the way forward? Either for you specifically with your own, direction and initiatives, and for us as activists and advocates for sortition. Maybe I wouldn't call it a movement at this point, but hoping to turn this initiative into a movement with a lot of popular support. So how can we make this happen?
So from my side, I'm hoping to just continue doing more research and work on the space. I just find it so interesting personally that I hope to just do more conceptual work on like what are some kind of governance models and where specifically could sortition fit. That's something I'm working on. But what interests me even more is like working with organizations to implement it and see really how it works. Like what are the differences between doing this in a co-op versus a municipal government. Like we don't know a lot about that, so just like really like starting from the basics in some ways and building up a research program of findings and learnings, more importantly, to help others get started as well. At core though, I think like in terms of this area of democratic practice, I think it's so important to make these ideas just accessible, clear, and available to practitioners in the space. Hopefully more and more are going to be checking out Equality by Lot and reading these books, but just given how busy people are, I think many care a lot about this issue. They want their democracy to work. And if someone could come to them with a few-page blueprint saying like, here's how you could, boost engagement and make it more representative, many would say like, that sounds great. Like, I'd like to get started. Can you help me? And once there is that support or that community of practice available, I think the momentum can really start picking up. So that's what I think would be an exciting and in many ways ideal agenda to get this movement going for sure.
All right, I think that kind of brought us to the end. Any concluding remarks? Any points that I missed? Something you want to say that you think is important for people that are interested in this topic? No,
I would just say thank you again for being interested in this article and for wanting to chat about it. And I mean, for anyone who's watching or listening and wants to explore these ideas or chat more about this or critique any of them, please feel free to reach out to me anytime. And I'd love to have a conversation about it, again, in the spirit of getting these ideas moving and into the mainstream of the practice of democratic organizations. Cool. All right. So thank you very much, Simon. I really enjoyed reading your article. I think I want to see I think there is a I guess I mentioned it already. I think there is a widespread sentiment that our society is not as democratic as it should be, as it purports to be, as maybe we once believed it is, and that
there is a a wide shared sentiment that among a large part of the population that we want to make it more democratic, and I think efforts like yours and I believe that Sortition is an important tool, and efforts like yours that promote it serve a very, very important purpose. So thank you for your work, and thank you for talking to me, and good luck with promoting it and getting things rolling.
Thanks so much again.
All right. See you.
Bye.